Hello, hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. This season, I will be narrating for you the young adult romance Blemished Beauty by Brenda Hodnett, which, by the way, you can buy the printed copy of on Amazon. Today we are on Chapter 18 and Chapter 19 of Blemished Beauty. Here we go. Chapter 18, Spit It Out. May 25th, 4 months later. College! Ma nodded her head, smiling pleasantly. I'm so happy you are doing this again, Tom. Tom watched his stout mother stand in front of the kitchen sink, scrubbing a pan hard with the sound of steel wool scratching against metal. Even from his seat at the kitchen table, he could see her forearms drenched in soap and water all the way to the purple sleeves rolled up past her elbows. You think it's too late for me? Tom asked. Oh, no, son. It's never too late. I'm proud of you. I really am. Ma turned her gaze toward Tom for a moment and smiled sweetly at him. Tom returned a small smile. His mother was so good. He couldn't fathom how easily she had forgiven him for all the turmoil he had put her through. I hope you know how grateful I am for you and all you've done for me, Ma. Ma turned toward him again. You're welcome, son. Now I'd be grateful to you if you'd help me with these dishes. Tom immediately got to his feet. Oh, I'm sorry, Ma. I would have helped sooner if my feet weren't so tired from standing through that awful university orientation today. Ma smiled at him again. I know. That's why I let you rest as long as you did. He and his ma washed and rinsed and dried the dishes in silence for a few minutes. He was happy to be at her side. Are you planning on seeing that girl once you move to Broxville? Ma inquired. Which girl is that? Tom asked as he watched the circular motion of his towel. You know who I mean, Ma said as she twisted the plug in the sink to let the dirty water drain. Tom sighed and dried the other side of his plate more slowly. Yes, I'm planning on it, but I'm not planning on anything coming of it, he said softly. You already sound discouraged, his ma said, drying her hands. Nah, Tom said as he started to unload the drying rack by placing some plates in the cupboard above him. He had only picked up 3 plates before he felt his mother's stare. He stopped and twisted to look at her. She was facing him now with one hand on her hip, her dark green apron streaked with dampness. She had that motherly look on her face, the look he remembered when he came into the house covered in mud from head to toe with a handful of worms. You like this one, Daphne, she declared. It was pointless to deny it. Tom shrugged. So? And you think a lot about her, she pointed out. It almost sounded like an accusation. Now she was definitely being his mother, as she somehow found it necessary to state the obvious. Tom raised his eyebrows and shrugged again as he resumed emptying the drying rack. Son, look at me, Ma insisted. Tom moaned softly and shifted to face his mother. Even with Tanya, you didn't act this way, she professed. Tom cringed. Did his mother really still think about that awful time? With Tanya, you were so convinced you loved her you wouldn't listen to reason. You were infatuated, but not in love. Tom pressed his lips firmly together and forced himself to set the towel gently on the table. That's not fair, Ma. I did love her, even though it didn't make sense. Now, do we have to talk about Tanya? She's the last person I want to think about. That brings me to my next point. You never thought about Tanya the way you think about this girl, Daphne. Tom wrinkled his brow. How do you know what I think? He asked. His mother quickly started to wipe off the counter with a damp cloth as she spoke. Well, it's because of what you say. When you talked about Tanya before, you would just tell us the fun things you did together, or how thick her hair was. Things like that. When you talk about Daphne, you talk about deeper things, like her character, her values, her goals. It's easy to see how much more you truly admire Daphne. This time Tom groaned loudly. He usually appreciated that he had a relationship with his family that allowed him to speak somewhat freely. However, at the moment, he wished he had never mentioned Daphne's name. He grabbed some glasses that were still a little wet inside and placed them a bit forcefully into the cupboard next to the plates. His mother rinsed her washcloth in the sink and then turned to face Tom again in the exact same position as before, her hand on her hip, ready to force out a confession. "You still haven't told me everything about this girl," she accused. Tom tossed his head back and sighed as he shut the cupboard door. "How many adult sons do you know who give their mothers details about their love interests?" "I don't care what other people do. You need to talk to me about this. Your broken heart from before seems to have ripped open again." Tom cringed as his mother's words described exactly how he felt. He closed his eyes for a long moment and turned so his back was leaning against the counter. He folded his arms and stared at his feet. "You know you cannot hide this from me much longer," Ma continued. "I have given you time to digest whatever it is that's been bothering you this past month, but I can't take your moping much longer. Now tell me what happened," she demanded. "You two were obviously involved somehow." Tom tilted his head back to stare at the ceiling. "No, not really, Ma." Tom's mother must have thought Tom didn't see her hand on her hip, because she lifted it and pinned it there again. "Didn't you tell her how you feel? A girl can't do anything if you don't tell her." Tom moved his head to give his mother a confused, exasperated look. His ma almost sounded mad. "I would talk about it if I wanted to, Ma." Ma sighed an enormous sigh, as if trying to calm herself. She took the towel Tom had placed on the counter, folded it neatly, and tucked it over the self-made hanger next to the sink. Slowly she turned to face her son again. "Thomas, you'll never understand how a mother worries about her son." Tom cocked his head to one side, giving her a disapproving look. Now she was playing the sympathy card. "Just tell me if you told her how you feel," she insisted. Tom shook his head in frustration and stared at the ground again. He did want to talk to someone about this. Maybe his ma sensed that, but it was too humiliating to speak out loud. "Does that little shake of the head mean you didn't?" his mother asked softly. "I asked her to marry me, Ma," Tom announced abruptly, "and she said no." Ma's eyes widened to twice their original size, looking completely surprised. "She doesn't love me," Tom whispered bitterly. Ma's face softened into complete sympathy and sadness. "Oh, son," she said as she stepped toward him and embraced him in the tightest motherly hug she could muster. Tom returned her embrace, desperately wishing his mother's love could fill the agonizing void inside him. But he knew it couldn't. Chapter 19. David. Daphne walked out of her college English class, a blue binder tucked under her arm. The broad hallway was filling up with pupils from all the rooms connected to the hall. She paused a moment to see which exit would have less traffic. "How did you do on your term paper?" came a voice from behind her. Daphne turned around to see one of her classmates. "Oh, hi, David. I did well, I guess. I got an A, so Professor Harper must have liked it." "You got an A?" David scratched his head, his cheeks ruddy. "I wish I did. I never seem to remember what I read, so it's hard for me to write a paper about it." "Well, the term paper isn't a huge chunk of your grade, so I'm sure you will do just fine in the class." David smiled a little at that. Daphne liked the way David looked. He had deep blue eyes and sun-bleached hair, and his skin had a tan tone to it. He wasn't too tall or too short. There was really nothing not to like about him. She did feel a little strange when she would catch him staring at her. She didn't quite know why she was creeped out, because whenever he spoke to her, he seemed perfectly nice. David took a deep breath. "It feels good to have the semester over. That was my last final." "Oh, really? Congratulations. I have one more after this," said Daphne. "When?" "In a few minutes in the science building next door," Daphne said, motioning to the left with her head. David swallowed hard and suddenly looked a little nervous. "Can I take you to lunch afterward?" he asked. Daphne raised her eyebrows in surprise. Yes," she stuttered. David smiled broadly, showing his perfect teeth. "Great. I'll meet you outside the science building at noon. Does that work?" "Of course," she replied, returning his smile. The two of them stood there in silence for a moment, both grinning from ear to ear. David let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, I'll see you then." Bye. Daphne waved and they both departed, going opposite directions down the hall. Daphne couldn't believe what had just happened. David DeLute asked her out. How many girls wished for that? As she pushed open the doors to exit into the sunshine, Daphne recalled a girls' night out party last Friday, where David DeLute's name had come up. What a hottie! Oh, and he is so rich. Have you seen the car he drives? Daphne had learned David's dad owned the power plant, and was the richest man in all of Brocksville. Apparently, he wanted his children to work for themselves, so all of his 5 children, David being the youngest, had attended college. One girl at the party, however, vehemently spouted that all the DeLutes were nothing but weasels and crooks. Nobody else believed her, and Daphne didn't either. There's always some jealous person who tries to undermine another's success. Daphne was so caught up with her thoughts about David, she did not hear someone behind her calling her name. Daphne! Hey, Daphne! Daphne whirled around to face the voice as she realized this must have been the 3rd or 4th time he had spoken. Totally shocked, she recognized the last person in the world she expected to see. Tom? She gasped. Tom cracked a smile as he walked toward her. The wind rustled through his fiery hair and his tan jacket ever so slightly. I was hoping to see you around here. How are you, Daphne? Daphne cleared her throat. I'm good. What are you doing here? Tom stuffed his hands into the pockets of his jacket and inhaled deeply. Well, now that it's spring, we were finally able to bury my pa. Oh, that's right. How did that go? She asked sympathetically. It went well, replied Tom casually. What are you doing here on campus? Daphne didn't know what else to say. I'm looking for a place to live. I'm going to attend school here. Oh, Daphne cried in pleasant surprise. You got in? You're going to Brocksville? Tom smiled a little shyly and nodded. That's incredible, Tom. Good for you. Thanks, Tom replied, but now his expression grew soft and thoughtful as he focused his gaze on her. Daphne felt chills run down her spine as she recognized that look. You look amazing, Daphne, Tom said, trying to sound casual. Ah, yes, you probably would think that now since you knew me before. Daphne pointed with both hands to her face. It's an off-season right now. My skin has been pretty clear lately, she said with a slight smile. Tom raised his eyebrows as if confused. Oh, he said, I didn't... Then he shook his head at the ground and glanced back up at her. It's not that, It's just great to see you, Daphne. You too, she said brightly. I wish we could catch up more, but I have to go take my last final. Can I take you to lunch when you're finished? Tom asked. 2 date offers in 1 day? This is new. Well, actually, You already have a date? Tom finished for her, looking not at all surprised. Yes, Daphne admitted. Tom cocked his head to one side. What's his name? He asked, feigning casualness. David DeLute. Tom's eyes abruptly bulged, and for a brief moment his face held a look of horror. Quickly he smoothed out his expression as he cleared his throat. Well, have fun. Good luck on your final. Thank you. I'll see you later. Tom nodded, and Daphne spun around quickly and ran toward the front doors of the science building. She didn't quite know why she was nervous. Was it because she was having lunch with David, or because she had seen Tom again? Maybe she was just anxious for her last final of the semester to be over. 3 hours later, Daphne swiftly unlocked the door to her dorm and ran through her rectangular kitchen, down the hall with the long vanity, and into her tiny bedroom. Out of breath, she plopped her heavy backpack down on her bed and almost immediately plopped herself right next to it. Her roommate was lying on her stomach across her bed on the other side of the small room. Laurel's feet were up in the air and crossed at the ankles. She had long, smooth, tan legs. She was staring at a textbook and was deep in thought. She hardly seemed to notice Daphne's presence. Without looking up from her reading, she muttered, Hey, Daphne. Hey, Laurel. You all finished with your finals? Yes, Daphne exclaimed as she scooted onto her bed so her back was against the wall. Should I let you study? No, said Laurel as she slammed her textbook closed and got into a sitting position. I'm burned out. Besides, Nothing I try to cram into my brain at this point will make much of a difference. Laurel shifted onto her bed, so her back was also against the wall, and the two girls were facing each other across their miniature room. This was common for them when they talked with each other, almost like a ritual. For a moment, Laurel scrutinized Daphne's face. This glow of yours is much more than the satisfaction of doing well on your finals. What's going on with you? Laurel was curious. I'm not glowing, Daphne protested, trying not to smile too big. What are you grinning about? Laurel pressed. Daphne shrugged, leaving her grin in place. It's a secret. Laurel cocked her head to one side, giving Daphne a disapproving look. What? Asked Daphne in a high, excited tone. It's a guy, isn't it? She said in her that-is-out-of-this-world voice. Laurel slid her textbook to the side and lay on her stomach, facing Daphne, putting her chin on her fists. Tell me everything. Don't leave out a single detail, she demanded. Daphne smiled brightly and flipped some hair behind her back. It's nothing. Laurel rolled her eyes. It never is, according to you, she declared. How about you start with his name? Daphne pursed her lips, trying not to appear too pleased. David Delute. Laurel let out an audible gasp and then smacked her bed with her palm. Get out! Are you serious? She cried, her voice creeping to an extremely high squeal at the end. Daphne nodded and covered her mouth as she tried to keep in the uncontrollable giggles escaping her lips. No way! Laurel cried again in the same high squeal. This time she swung her legs around to the ground so she was sitting on the edge of her bed. She looked very proper as she sat up tall with perfect posture. Her entire expression and body language said she was alert and intensely focused. How do you know him? She asked. He's in Professor Harper's class with me. Laurel slammed both her palms down on the bed again with giddy surprise, her eyes getting bigger by the second. David Delute was in your English class all semester and you didn't even tell me? Laurel squeaked. Daphne giggled involuntarily again. I didn't think anything would come of it, she admitted. Did he ask you out? Daphne nodded, unable to keep the smile off her face. We went to lunch. This time Laurel put her hands on her lap and leaned forward. Get out! She squealed. Daphne laughed out loud. Crazy, isn't it? No, Laurel exclaimed, standing up now. He's only the handsomest, richest guy on campus. Of course he would want you. Daphne rolled her eyes. That makes 0 sense, Laurel. Laurel returned the eye rolling, just more dramatically as she let out an irritated sigh. You're the one who makes 0 sense, Daphne, Laurel countered. When are you going to stop being so anti-you? I'm not anti-me, Daphne protested. I just know what guys are all about. Laurel's eyes remained huge as she put one hand on her hip. Oh, really? Well, please enlighten me because I would love to know. They only care about looks, Daphne announced. Laurel rolled her whole head as she took a few slow steps toward the dresser on the south wall. Oh, Daphne, not all of them. Yes, all of them, Daphne confirmed sternly. Laurel turned to face her again. Well, okay, they do, but that's not all they care about. Not all guys are pigs. Daphne put her head back on the wall as she spoke. Then how do you explain this? A few months ago, my face was completely covered with acne, and not a single guy looked at me. Now that my complexion is sometimes almost entirely clear, guys ask me out for lunch. I don't think that's a coincidence. But it is, said Laurel, pacing a little now as if she were giving a lecture in a classroom. The only reason they didn't ask you out before was because you were too self-conscious and never spoke to anyone. They ask you out now because you were a little less so, and you smile back occasionally. Daphne shook her head, feeling somewhat irritated Laurel was saying this to her. Besides, Laurel continued, popping back down on her bed, guys did talk to you a few months ago, and they liked you too. You were just too blind and stubborn to see it because you thought such a thing couldn't be possible. Such a thing wasn't possible, Daphne protested, a bit sourly. Ugh, Laurel groaned in frustration, throwing her hands up in the air. Sometimes you're so difficult. Guys liked you then too. Daphne felt like glaring at Laurel, but tried not to. She hated when Laurel did this. She was such a wretched good friend. She always said things to make it sound like Daphne and she were on the same level. But it wasn't true. She couldn't accuse Laurel of lying because Laurel genuinely believed what she said. All Daphne could do was try to prove her otherwise. Name one person who liked me when I was a pizza face, Daphne insisted. Laurel scowled deeply at her. I hate that phrase. Sorry, name one person, she repeated. Well, let's see, Laurel said, trying to think as she crossed her legs on the bed. Oh, yes, that red-headed guy at the cabin you were stranded with, who liked you so much he wanted to marry you. I think he certainly counts, don't you? Laurel asked a little bitterly. Daphne felt an unexpected chill race up her spine. I was a rebound to him, Daphne clarified. Said Laurel, cocking her head and pursing her lips as she stood deep in thought. Guys do rebound for sure, but, she said slowly, they generally don't go as far as proposing. This time Laurel looked Daphne straight in the eye. Daphne slowly blew out a gush of air. I saw him today, she confided. Laurel perked up and furrowed her brows together. Who, your cabin boyfriend? Daphne nodded. On campus. What is he doing here? Laurel questioned. Daphne shrugged. He says he's going to school here next year and was looking for a place to live. I think it's great, actually. You want him to... Laurel began. Not like that, Laurel. I'm just glad he's starting to make decisions for his life. Is that why you said no to him? Because you thought he wasn't going anywhere? Daphne shrugged. Not exactly. It's mostly because of me. What about you? Laurel asked carefully. Daphne didn't want to have such a serious conversation at the moment. I don't deserve someone like Tom Moulton, she said, trying to sound casual. She was never going to let Laurel know Tom was an alcoholic. Her friend could be a bit judgmental sometimes. Laurel sighed and slouched as she looked sadly at Daphne. And to get married, we barely knew each other. Well, sometimes people know right away, Laurel pointed out. Well, I didn't know, Daphne admitted. Laurel nodded thoughtfully. You must have made the right choice then. I'm only sorry you will see him around sometimes now. Why do you say that? Daphne wondered. It's good he's doing this. I know, Laurel agreed. But you were so sad when you first came back from his cabin. I don't want that to happen to you again. Daphne smiled half-heartedly. Thanks, but I'll be okay. I've moved on. I wish I could hear more about your date with David. But I have to go take my last final, Laurel declared. Daphne shrugged. It was a typical date for me. I can summarize it in 2 sentences. Laurel raised her eyebrows as she started stuffing her backpack with notebooks. He looked gorgeous and made a lot of jokes, and I blushed practically the entire time, Daphne confessed. Laurel smiled back. Sounds like it's going somewhere, she teased. Daphne chuckled and shook her head as she heard a knock at the front door. Will you come to the door with me? Asked Laurel. That way I won't feel bad leaving the conversation if you're here to stay and talk. Daphne slid across her bed and onto her feet. She followed Laurel all the way into the kitchen. Daphne stood a few paces behind as Laurel opened the door to welcome their visitor. Hi! Laurel's voice was saturated with sweetness, so Daphne knew their guest was a guy. He was sure to be disappointed when he discovered Laurel had to leave and would be stuck with her instead. Hi, replied the man. Is Daphne here? Daphne's heart jolted at the sound of this voice. She stepped aside to see if her ears were telling the truth. They were. Tom's eyes turned to Daphne as she came into his view. Oh, there you are, he said with a warm smile. Daphne tried to greet him but choked on her words. Laurel took this opportunity to introduce herself. I'm Laurel, she said, extending a friendly hand towards him. I don't believe we've met. Tom peeled his eyes off Daphne and met Laurel's gaze again. Oh, no, we haven't. I'm Tom. Laurel glanced back at Daphne with a look of utter shock. Daphne just raised her eyebrows in return. Well, I have to run off to my last final. It was so nice to meet you, Tom, declared Laurel in her sweetest voice. Daphne mentally winced as she felt an unexpected yet forceful scorch of jealousy burn her. Now that Laurel knew he was Tom, she knew Laurel would never purposely try to flirt with him or invite his attentions. Daphne also knew, after seeing Laurel next to her, Tom would fall for her friend, just like every other guy. As Laurel slid out the door, she turned her head to look back at Daphne and gave her an intense look. Daphne interpreted as, "You better tell me everything later." Daphne nodded and Laurel promptly shut the door behind her. leaving Daphne alone in the now awkward space of Tom Moulton. And that concludes Chapter 19. Just a fun fact about Blemished Beauty. The year after it was published, it received the Silver Quill Award, which is basically second place in the category of newly published novels, from the League of Utah Writers. I don't live in Utah, but I submitted my book to them, and they gave me the Silver Quill Award, which I was absolutely thrilled about. So anyway, I was going to announce that at the beginning of the podcast season, but I didn't, so I'm announcing it now. Anyway, I hope you join me next time to continue the journey with Daphne. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.